The night tasted like salt and panic. Torches pinwheeled through a mass of people and animals pressed against the Red Sea, a dark band under a dim moon. Children cried. Goats pulled at their ropes. Somewhere back along the trail, a murmur turned to a rhythm, metal on wood, leather on stone, until the ground itself carried the beat of 600 Egyptian chariots. Men shielded their families and stared at the water. There was no bridge, no boat, and no time. Moses stood where the sand gave way to rippled shoal, a staff in his hand, and a desert wind in his face. He could hear the panic gathering behind him as clearly as he heard the army closing. Not long before, those same people had left Egypt in a rush, carrying dough that had not risen and memories that had not healed. They believed their captors had yielded for good. But grief hardens into rage, and Pharaoh had changed his mind. He called up his elite charioteers, the fast arm of an empire, and sent them into the wilderness with orders to bring the slaves back or leave nothing standing. The route had always been fragile. The people followed a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, moving camp to camp along ground that could not feed them for long. The sea drew them to a narrow pocket of coast, Pi Hahiroth, between wilderness and water, a place that looks like a choice and is not one. Scouts came in with dust on their faces and fear in their voices. The army was close. Behind the crowd, the horizon turned into a dirty band where wind lifted sand and horses shoveled the ground to powder. The fear spoke. It came in questions sharper than accusation because they sounded like fact. Were there no graves in Egypt? Why lead us here to die? The elders found Moses and asked for a plan that did not exist. He looked at the sea, then at the pillar, and waited. He did not pretend courage he did not feel. He prayed because there was nothing else to do with breath. The answer changed the shape of the night. The pillar moved from the head of the column to its rear, settling between the Israelites and the oncoming line of chariots. To the Egyptians, it burned hot and bright, a sheet of light that turned the desert floor to glass. To the Israelites, it cast a deep shadow, a shelter that muted the sound of their fear. The army halted. For the first time since sunset, the people stopped moving. They could hear the sea. The wind rose. At first, it was the kind of wind that scours skin and pulls at clothing. Then it thickened into a force from the east that shoved against the sea itself. The water did not simply drift back as a tide does. It got up and held, as if the wind had found a grip and would not let go. Moses lifted his staff at the shoreline and stood with his feet planted in wet sand while the noise built. The surface tore. A channel widened. The seabed entered the night like a road uncovered by a hand. Someone tested it with a stick. Someone else pressed a heel into mud that stayed firm. Families gathered their bundles and moved, first in clusters and then in a stream, following Moses into the gap between walls of water that gleamed with trapped motion. They did not move quickly. Old men leaned on staffs. Mothers carried infants with fingers pressed against tiny backs to feel breath. Herds balked at the roar and then obeyed the pull of rope and voice. The people went forward because forward was the only direction that did not end in iron. The crossing was work. It did not feel like spectacle. It felt like cautious steps on slick ground while wind pushed and the sound of the sea pressed against the ears. Torches hissed and died in spray. Moonlight lit the water from within so that fish hung like coins behind glass. Here and there men widened the path with their shoulders because a cart found a narrow place and everything behind it had to stop. A woman tripped and lost a sandal and kept going without it, holding her child in the hand of a cousin, telling herself that later she would find another shoe. Hours passed that felt like a single long moment. Dawn announced itself in a lighter stripe above the eastern rim. On the far bank, Moses and the first ranks reached dry ground and turned, counting without meaning to. The pillar still stood between them and the army, a high wall of flame and smoke that made distance a color. Then it lifted. On the other side, the chariots saw the opened sea. Orders carried down the line. Whips cracked. Horses lowered their heads and took the slope at a run. The first chariots entered the corridor, and the sound changed from a drumbeat to the rattling clatter of wheels over rutted ground. Egyptian drivers had earned their arrogance. They had chased Bedouin and rebels in country worse than this and won. They had never followed an enemy into a road cut from water. At first they made speed. Then the surface turned against them. The path that had been firm under bare feet became heavy under iron. Wheels sank, axles grabbed. The wind shifted and threw spray into faces. Horses slipped and drove their weight into harness with no purchase. Crews jumped down to push, and the line behind them piled into the jam with the logic of mass. A driver cursed and tried to cut his horse free. A lieutenant raised a horn to call the withdrawal and swallowed a mouthful of salt. Panic is an infection with no cure but distance. There was no distance left. On the shore, Moses lifted his staff again. He had not caused any of it. He did the one thing he had been told to do: raise his hand, stand where he was put, and wait for the sea to obey its maker. When he brought his staff down, the wind quit like a door slammed in a storm. The walls leaned and then collapsed together with a noise that made language impossible. Water crushed wood and men alike without pause or malice. The pathway closed in a single motion that took many lives and no time. When the roar ended, the only sound was what a normal sea makes. The pillar had done its work and was gone. The people did not shout. Some sobbed from their backs because their legs refused to stand. Some stared at the place where the road had been until the light hurt their eyes. The waves laid fragments at their feet. Planks, a broken wheel, a sword twisted into a shape it had never taken in a forge. The army that had pursued them across generations of memory lay quiet under water that looked as if it had never moved. What followed is often told as a song, and it was a measured account of a horse and its rider cast into the sea, of right hands and strong arms, and a people brought through. But the day after the song was quieter. The camp smelled of wet wool and fear burned off by sun. Children slept in piles. Men checked animals for injuries that had waited until safety to announce themselves. Moses and Aaron walked the perimeter without speaking because there was nothing useful to say. Freedom had moved from a promise to a fact. Facts carry weight. The investigation of a miracle is not like the investigation after a fire or a wreck. There were no measurements to take, no char to scrape. The evidence was a pathway no longer present and a people who had crossed it. The questions the elders put to Moses were practical because survival is practical. Where would water come from now? Where would food? What law would bind families who had known only orders and quotas? Moses answered with what he had: a direction toward Sinai, and a trust that the one who had split the sea would not abandon them in the dry land beyond it. They moved inland. The sea fell behind a line of dunes and turned back into a rumor. Memory did its chemistry, turning terror into testimony and testimony into instruction. Parents told children exactly what they had seen and forbade them to soften it with metaphor. Scribes would someday write it in a steady hand. The place names, the sequence, the parts no sane listener would believe unless they had seen a river turn and a sky go dark months earlier. The story belonged not to spectacle, but to a ledger of justice, plagues that forced a tyrant's hand, a departure at speed, a chase, a trap, an opening, an end. Moses did not become a magician in that crossing. He remained what he had been since a bush burned and was not consumed, a reluctant leader whose courage had to be renewed with each order. His staff was a stick. His stance at the shore was obedience. The people did not become heroes. They became something harder, accountable. No overseer stood above them now. No one else would decide when they ate or where they slept. The sea had closed, and with it the option of returning to the certainty of captivity. Years later, standing on different ground with different threats ahead, they would return to this night in their telling. The point would not be the drowning of enemies, though hatred makes that an easy place to stop. The point would be that a way opened where none existed, and that stepping onto it required the kind of trust that empties a person of alternatives. The law they would receive at Sinai would root itself in that moment. Commands about rest, truth, and neighbor would hang on the knowledge that they had once walked between walls of water because someone told them to move. Stand at a modern shoreline in a hard wind and you can pretend to hear it. The long rush, the high hiss, the sudden hush when pressure changes. The sea hides its history well. It remembers in salt, not in shapes. The people remember in names. They name the day, the place, the order of events. They name the fear so that their children will not need to reinvent it, and the deliverance so that their children will know where to look when the path ahead looks like water. That is the record as straight as it can be told, trapped between chariots and deep water, a people held by a column of cloud, an east wind that worked through the night, a corridor that did not exist and then did, a crossing, a collapse, and a silence. It is also the beginning of responsibility. On the far shore, they were no one's property. They were witnesses. They would be asked to live as if they remembered what it took for them to breathe free air. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.